Okay, great. Well, I can see people are still trickling in. Great to see so many of you on today's webinar. My name's Hayden Banks. I'm the Advocacy Manager at Climate Outreach, and our webinar today is Attitudes to Adaptation, How to Frame a Resilient Present and Future. I'm thrilled to be chairing this webinar today alongside a fantastic range of speakers, and we hope you get a lot out of it. Thank you for joining us. Firstly, for those of you who don't know, Climate Outreach is a climate communications charity, and we exist to help policymakers, communicators, anyone engaging with the public to tell a different climate story and to understand where the public are, what they're thinking and feeling, and how we can communicate in a way that brings people with us. We launched the adaptation research this week in partnership with the MACC Hub, the Maximising UK Adaptation to Climate Change Hub, which is hosted by King's College London. And as you'll all be aware, it's an extremely timely release because we're in our third heatwave of the year. We've had warnings from the Met Office this week that this is now going to be our new reality, and the climate that we had in the 20th century has now gone, and we need to prepare for this kind of intensity of heatwave being a new reality. And also the really dire warnings and announcements that actually the heat waves that we've been experiencing over the last couple of months led to the excess deaths of over 2,700 people. So a really kind of shocking time that we're living through, and we hope this research will help us all understand how we communicate the importance of the changes that we need to people in their day-to-day lives. Our government are starting to take notice with the severity of the situation that we're in. They announced this week that they'll set stronger adaptation targets when the next adaptation plan is due in 2028. And they've announced significant investment as well in research and developing the evidence base in what we need to adapt in the UK. But crucially today, we're concerned with what do the public think about all of this? What do they think and feel, and how do they think we should respond to this reality, and how do we communicate this effectively? So I'm really pleased to say I'm joined by a brilliant set of speakers. So we'll be starting off with Dr. Chris Pollard, and Chris leads the research team at Climate Outreach and led this research. We'll then pass to Bea Natzler, who is from the highly influential UK Climate Change Committee, who are the UK government's independent advisor on climate change, and Bea's going to talk us through the Well Adapted UK report and assessing kind of the role and impacts of adaptation on households, businesses and financial institutions. And we'll then hear from Sophie Jenkinson, who is founding director of Round Our Way. And Round Our Way is an organisation that exists to tell the stories of climate impacts and to make sure that the voices and concerns of working class people and people who are too often overlooked by the climate agenda and climate debate get heard, and that their voices and experiences are really at the centre of our thoughts and our conversation. So in terms of housekeeping, there should be a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please do, as the webinar progresses, put your questions in that function, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. We'll have the speakers until about 11:30, 11:35, and we should have about 25 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer some of those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Dr. Chris Pollard, who Chris is going to speak for about 15 minutes on the research today. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Hayden. I will share my slides. Can you see those okay?
Yes.
Brilliant, thanks. So welcome everyone this morning. My name is Chris Pollard. I'm going to be talking, well, a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the research and what it means in our recommendations for this part of work. So attitudes on adaptation, how to frame a resilient present and future. This forms part of our Britain Talks Climate and Nature research online. We have different chapters. We call them chapters. They're basically how to engage and communicate on climate on different kinds of topics. And this is the latest one that we've done on adaptation. Previously, it was from 2025, where we did a lot of research to create a lot of chapters, and we've added a few more since then to expand the knowledge. And this one specifically about adaptation, done this year with the MACC Hub. So this is what the website looks like, where we keep all our findings and our recommendations. If you go on Climate Outreach website and click on the Britain Talks Climate and Nature, you'll see that we have the Insights report. That's on the left there. That has all the plots, all the data, all the recommendations, all the descriptions, and all the detail of everything we talk about across all those different chapters and those different topics. And on the right there, you'll see we also have a communications toolkit, and that's super stripped down, super simple. You go on there, you click which audience you want to speak to, you click the topic you want to speak about, and it gives some really clear do's and don'ts about how to appeal to people as a great starter for good climate communication and engagement. The bottom bit there about the different 7 British segments is the way that we have framed this research, thinking about people's values and looking at how different values which are prominent in Great Britain and how you can use those to be able to engage people and communicate better. I'll get into a little bit more detail about what that actually means in a sec. But what about this research? What about adaptation while we're all here today? These are the top 3 things to know that came out from the research this year and last year. Number 1 there, don't force a separation between adaptation and mitigation actions. People want climate action overall, and they instinctively bring a both and perspective of different kinds of actions that are mitigation. We might call them mitigation adaptation in terms of research or policy or campaigning, but most people just come to it with an instinctive everything together approach for climate action. We can really use that and build with that. Number 2, show climate adaptation making lives better. Specific concrete examples, not abstract concepts. Things happening right now in real communities, showing people this is what adaptation looks like and this is why it's good and makes people's lives better. And number 3, use our positive view of restoring nature. So our positive view being the country's positive view of restoring nature. We can show how nature and wildlife can help us adapt to the changing climate and how it can reduce future risks by lowering carbon emissions as well. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these 3 with some of the data behind it in a second. But firstly, Britain Talks Climate and Nature. For those of you who don't know this bit of work that we've started last year and as I said, continuing on, what is it and what does it do? Well, it's efforts to try and understand how people in Britain think and feel about climate change. And for us, climate outreach and the folks we work with, that word feel is really, really important. People's emotions and feelings about climate change, things that are happening out the window, but also climate actions, who's taking them and why. That's really important because it's the emotions and the feelings that can really drive what people's behaviours are. We do that in this work through having last year a nationally representative survey of Great Britain, England, Scotland and Wales, over 7,000 people surveyed, and then with focus groups that we held at the time, and then lots more focus groups since then on different topics to dig into more detail about how we can communicate and engage better. And we use the model first developed by More in Common last year of 7 different values-based segments of the British population. So instead of looking at segmenting people in Britain on demographics like age groups or ethnicity or wealth or region, we're looking at how people come together with shared values and what those shared values mean for what's important to them, or how we can be authentic in our communications that's really going to chime with what they care about in their lives, their identity and their worldview. Here, very briefly, if you're not familiar with the segments, are the 7 segments in GB. Of course, there's loads more data on how these segments interact with climate on our website and on More in Common's website about many other topics as well. So do check those out. I'll just very briefly go around them all. We'll start in the top left. There's overall the 7 segments. There's 3 larger ones, around 20% of the population of GB each, and 4 smaller ones, around 10% each. And starting in the top left there, the purple one is skeptical scrollers. They're not skeptical of climate change. They do believe that climate change is real and is happening. They're just very skeptical of information flows and people talking about lots of different things. In terms of climate, they're online, they're engaged, they're up for radical change, but they feel alienated by the way climate decisions are made. Moving anti-clockwise round to the first of the larger groups, in red there, the rooted patriots. They're proud of Britain's past and their community. They want a climate future they can be proud of. They're very concerned about climate. They really want to see climate action. They're quite positive about climate actions, but they're very much focused on the communities, what's important, what's good and bad, very locally to them. Moving around to the established Liberals in blue, another of the smaller groups. They believe we're moving in the right direction on climate through a mix of technology, innovation, and global cooperation. They tend to be the most optimistic of all the segments on many things, including climate. They're also the most financially well off. Moving around to the incrementalist left in turquoise, believe in communities and leaders working together on climate change to improve the status quo. They're also quite optimistic, not quite as much as the established Liberals, quite optimistic and see that we are making progress, but seeing on a smaller scale about working with each other and communicating locally to make those make further advances on the actions that we're taking. Then in pink, the dissenting disruptors. They recognise the need to tackle climate change, but believe the system is rigged and they're leaving them behind. Quite cynical about climate action, tend to be less supportive of climate actions than most of the other groups in general, though do want to see climate action taken, and generally think we need a bit of a shake-up, a bit of radical changes within society in general. Then there's the traditional conservatives. They believe in respecting the environment, but worry that climate action is overbearing and unfair. So again, they're quite cynical and less supportive in general of climate actions like the dissenting disruptors, but differing from that group, they're much more, they don't want to see big radical change within society, more trust in the kind of existing institutions, even if they don't like what they're doing right now. Progressive activists is the final group. They want climate action to make a world a better place. Really want to see radical action and changes in society, but different radical changes than the dissenting disruptors, and generally very worried about climate change and very pro lots of different types of climate action. So like I said, loads more information about these segments on our website and on More in Commons website too. So let's delve a little bit more into those three headline findings. The first one is, don't force separation between adaptation and mitigation actions. People want both. When we asked people in the survey last year about policy priorities, what are your top priorities for government policies to respond to climate change? And asked people to select 3 from 16 different options that we gave them. And this is basically saying what should climate policy do? And if we really loosely categorize them by pure adaptation, pure mitigation, or kind of both, and then there's white, which doesn't really fall into that. You can see that there's the mitigation ones come like prioritizing lower emissions as fast as possible. They come up quite high for some people. There's ones in the middle there about adaptation, specifically protecting people from property from extreme weather events, come for a couple of them quite high. But the ones which are both together, supporting wildlife, supporting farmers, food supply, these are things that are automatically really, really important to people, and they're not separating out these different kinds of actions. These are the messages, these are the frames that are really important and really cut through to people. It's about climate change and everything around it, not just one or the other. But here's an interesting quote that was quite typical of some progressive activists as well that we spoke to. We went from global warming to climate change, and now it's climate adaptation. With every passing, benchmark that we miss, we lower the urgency and the vocabulary that we use. This person is typical of someone who thinks that if we're just talking about climate adaptation, then we're giving up and we're saying, oh, we're not going to reduce emissions, we're just giving up and we're going to adapt that now. And we really don't want to be leaning into any kind of narratives around that. We know that we have to do both at the same time. We don't want to lose really engaged people like this person from London. Secondly, showing adaptation making lives better. So here, as we say with a lot of communications and engagement on lots of different topics, it's showing real examples of people close to home that they care about, that is meaningful for their lives, that they can relate to. If we just look at the words themselves, climate adaptation and climate resilience, another similar word that I guess in policy or research or campaigning circles, climate adaptation, climate resilience might have people have very different definitions, but you also do see them a lot used interchangeably in communications and engagement around climate. And you can see here for climate adaptation, just that word, that term on its own, around half people said they were clear what it means. Where it came to climate resilience, just less than half, but not too dissimilar on people on what they think that means. When we delved into this year in the focus groups, climate adaptation, people weren't sure what it meant. they thought it might have a technical definition, but they kind of worked it out. They can work it out what it was when we were discussing it. So it does have meaning for people. And it came out of something that was active. It meant to them changing your habits, building flood defences, like doing things. When we discussed what climate resilience could mean, was that the same? What was that different? It came more about being passive, about coping with changes of things to come. Being hard-headed and putting your head down and just getting through stuff. And that's not the kind of tone that we want to say about having this vision of better for the future. So what does that mean? What evidence do we have around that as well, that vision for the future? So here you can see at the top, if you present that as technical terms, we also asked, not only is it clear, we asked if you might think it's a good or a bad thing, just that term, no context whatsoever. We've got sort of two in five people saying that they think climate adaptation is a good thing for whatever reason. But when we test something that adds a bit more detail, to what extent do you support or oppose the government investing in climate adaptation measures? You start to get support for this. There's over half of people are supporting it. And we're not even really explaining what climate adaptation is there. We're just saying, here's someone who's going to do something. And we're using the word investing, which is quite a positive thing about the future. And we're already starting to see that support or positive responses go up. But then the bottom one, where we've got 3/4 of people saying they agree, the government needs to take climate change seriously. That means focus on preparing us for the worst impacts of climate change, such as building better flood defences and making our homes more suited to the heat. So now we're not even using the word adaptation there. We're talking about what's going to be done and why, and there's that support coming up. And finally, of the three headlines is use our positive view of restoring nature. We know that when we asked people last year about what are the impacts of climate change that are most concern you over the next 10 years, impacts on climate and nature come in the top 2 for every single one of those segments. I think in the top 1 for 5 out of the 7 segments. So people are really concerned about what climate's going to happen with nature. So making sure that we're thinking about how to speak about adaptation. When we're speaking about adaptation, we can link it to benefits to nature or benefits from nature. And from the focus groups, restoring the balance between people and nature, this person was saying, I feel like the scales are protecting people against nature. So this person really doesn't like the way of thinking that we're separate, that we're protecting ourselves, and that we need to bring us back together. Other phrases like working with nature for adaptation came through really strongly across these different kind of value segments. And there can often be a sense when we're trying to do communications and engagement that action on the environment is sort of against. You can have that, or you can have stuff that's good for people's lives. And also increasingly maybe acting on climate is against nature. There's a versus between nature and climate, and a versus between environment and people, and that's we all know that that's wrong. We need to do it all together, and it's possible to do it together, and we need to stay on that message of bringing things together, nature and climate and people as much as possible. So strategic recommendations. This is the 3rd time I'm going to tell you the same thing, so it's really that's how important that we think this is. Most people want to see both adaptation and mitigation actions. Don't force that separation between the two. Show how tackling climate change makes lives and communities better, both by helping people get on with their lives and reducing those future harms. And show how people can work with nature to protect people and nature together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Really important insights there. I'm going to pass now to Bea Natzler from the Climate Change Committee to talk through her section. Go ahead, Bea.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So yeah, as Hayden said, my name's Bea and I work at the UK Climate Change Committee, the CCC. So we're the UK government's independent advisors on climate change. And one of the things that involves is every 5 years, we publish advice to government on the impacts of climate change to the UK and the actions that can be taken to address that. So I'm going to really briefly take you through our most recent advice, which was published this year on that, and then dive into the elements of that advice that really focused on what the public and citizens think about adaptation. So this graph here sets the context for the advice with which we give government, and it will be familiar to many of you on this call. If you look at the black and grey lines there, what they show is that global average surface air temperatures are now about 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and continuing to warm at record pace. If you look at the red and the purple lines there, they show projections for global average temperature change based on current policies to manage greenhouse gas emissions. So on our current trajectory, we can expect that by 2050, if you look at that orange dot there, we'll reach around 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature change compared to pre-industrial levels. So we structure our advice in part around that scenario. And we're really clear throughout that while we need to act to prepare for a 2-degree scenario world in 2050, this should go hand in hand with reducing greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, really chiming with what Chris said there. And you can see if you look at this green line here, that's projected global average temperature change under more ambitious policies for managing greenhouse gas emissions, which would be fantastic. But you can see even on that, some level of warming is still locked in. So we need to act now to prepare for that 2-degree world. So in our report, we set out some key risks that the UK will face as a result of a 2-degree world in 2050 and key actions that government can take to help to protect the people and places that we care about. And I'm just going to talk really briefly through three. So the first is heat, which is very topical. So in 2050, in a 2-degree scenario world, the hottest summers will be several degrees hotter than any summer to date. Heat waves could exceed 45 degrees Celsius with tropical nights for over a week. That's when the temperature doesn't drop below 20 degrees Celsius, even at night. And 92% of our homes would be at risk of overheating. So there's a clear, real need to act to help protect ourselves and others. So some of the key actions that we're saying government should take forward are investing in cooling for public services, so schools, hospitals, care homes, setting a maximum temperature regulation for workplaces, both for workers who are outside, really facing the heat, and those inside, and accelerating the uptake of cooling, whether that's passive cooling measures such as trees outside houses, shutters, or active cooling such as air conditioning, particularly for those most vulnerable to heating. The second key impact we highlight is flooding. So in that 2-degree scenario world in 2050, rainfall is expected to increase by between 15 to 60%. Peak river flows will increase by 45%, and sea levels will rise by 10 to 35 centimetres from today's level. And the implications of that are that we expect that the number of homes impacted by flooding would rise by 40%, with annual damages rising to £4.5 billion. So some key actions you can see here that we set for government are investing more in long-term flood defence programmes. That's both sort of large man-made flood defences as well as nature-based solutions and property-level defences, and ensuring new buildings are not increasing the risk of climate change impacts. So we're not building buildings in floodplains that are undefended. And thirdly and finally, for now, is on water shortages and droughts. So in that 2050 2-degree scenario world, some summers would see half the rainfall of a typical summer today. Water in rivers would decrease by 30%, and extreme agricultural drought would be 3 times more likely. So we'd like to see government ensuring regulation in the water sector maintains a clear focus on drought, including building appropriate reservoirs and ensuring new development is drought sensitive, so that it's not placing undue strain on our water supply. So that's some of the key sort of actions that we set out in our advice, but I really wanted to dive into some of the work we did on sort of public attitudes and citizens' views. So to start with, we reviewed the sort of published data on polling and attitudes to climate change, some of which has been touched on already and I saw come up in the Q&A as well. And it's a relatively clear picture in that concern for climate change remains high, with around 80% of the public saying they're very or fairly concerned, and that sort of remained the case for quite a few years. About 70% of the public think climate change needs to be addressed urgently, but over 80% feel the UK is not prepared for the impacts of climate change. However, we wanted to really dig deeper and understand what people would think once they really had a chance to chew over the impacts of climate change, but also the different options and financial trade-offs available to government for helping us adapt to climate change, what they thought we should focus on. So I'm just going to pull out a couple of key findings from a citizens panel that we convened. So we worked with Ipsos and ScienceWise to bring together a group of 30 members of the public from across the UK who were selected to be representative or reflective, I should say, of the UK public across a range of characteristics, including age, ethnicity, political leaning, income, etc. Most of them were from Manchester, which is where the discussions with the panel were held, but a number came from Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales as well to get the sort of wider regional perspective. And our panel members came together for 7 workshops and learnt from experts around what the impacts of climate change will be on the UK and what the different options are available to address those impacts. And there was lots of chance to ask questions, disagree, discuss and reflect. Discussions focused on impacts that would really affect people at an individual level. So they focused on overheating and flooding in homes and climate impacts on nature, transport, energy and water supply. So we had sort of discussions and detailed findings on each of those topics. But I thought for today, I'd just pull out some of the really cross-cutting findings that came up across the piece, because quite a few of them actually chime really quite strongly with the findings of Chris's research as well. So the first one is in the sort of early stages of the panel, we when we were discussing the impacts of climate change, we were really careful to make really clear the distinction between reducing emissions and adapting to the impacts of climate change, often using more accessible terms, a bit like Chris was touching on. And in those sessions, and then throughout the rest of the panel members were really clear that they felt that while adaptation was important, it was critical that this was not at the expense of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and they were really keen that that sort of was continued with real focus. Secondly, they were really keen that any adaptation was done was started with a matter of urgency and was done properly, so done in a long run way, not reactively, not in response to issues, but done in a way that would really last. Often independently as well across almost all of the sessions, they were keen that support was focused on the most vulnerable to climate impacts, whether that was people who are older, babies, people who are pregnant, ethnic minorities, there were those on lower incomes, depending on the hazards. They were really keen that came out strongly. And again, chiming with Chris's findings, there was strong support for effective nature-based solutions. There were some interesting discussions on the value of nature intrinsically, and while panel members felt that there was value in nature intrinsically, they also felt they would want to focus or like prioritize resource on working with nature in ways that would also benefit humans in terms of resilience, but they ultimately wanted both. They were keen that members of the public are more educated on this. A lot of them were quite surprised at the level of impacts we can expect to see, and they thought it was really important that the public was made aware of what's coming and what they can do to protect themselves and others. And then finally, we also explored the fact that adaptation comes at a cost and that many measures to adapt are going to cost things up front, even if they lead to greater protection later on. And while panel members in general were accepting of the fact there may be some personal responsibility for this, they felt that if they were going to need to pay more for, say, transport, energy, water to make these services more resilient, they were really keen that this was done in a really transparent way, that it was clear the money was being spent effectively and that it was ring-fenced and protected for adaptation action. There's lots more I could say on the panel. It was such a great learning for us and so useful to hear from members of the public and what they cared about. But yeah, I will stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bea. That was super interesting, and I really hope the government sort of heed some of those recommendations from that citizens panel. I know there's some questions a bit more that we can get into later on how that's going to happen. I'm now going to pass to our final speaker, last but not least, Sophie Jenkinson from Round Our Way. Over to you, Sophie.
Just get these up. Hold on a second. Is that all good? Someone give me a thumbs up. Good. Okay, cool. So as Hayden said in his intro, we tell stories about climate impacts in the UK. We also have a specific focus on working class communities. And from the segmentation that Chris outlined, we use Rooted Patriots as a guide for a lot of the work we do. Rooted Patriots, who are 20% of the population, are the most likely segment to self-identify as working class. So I'm just going to whip through some of the kinds of stories we do. And one of the things that we really believe is not just the kind of story that matters, but who gets to tell the story is as important as the story that is being told. So we've done, oh, hello. Hold on there, 1 second. I'm at the wrong end. So we've done all sorts of different stories in the media. So food prices, food and farming. We work with farmers a lot. The rising cost of different kinds of meals and different kinds of food. We've done loads of different things on flooding, so trains, football pitches, potholes. We've done a lot on potholes actually, but I won't go into it because it's quite complicated. It's not complicated. It's just not that. It's not as thrilling as some of the other things. We've done loads on sport, so flooding, dry ground, council games. We've done some stuff with influencers on that. We've done loads on trains and cancellations. We've done stuff on flood alerts. We've water tested some flood water to see what is left in people's homes and people's businesses after flood water leaves, which is, I don't know if you've ever smelled flood water, but it's not great. We've talked about where flooding is most likely to happen and the kinds of constituencies where flooding is most likely to happen. So 8 out of the top 10 most flooded constituencies have Reform is the highest polling party in that constituency at the moment, or when we did the research, but it's almost certainly the same. We've done loads on hot classrooms, hot hospitals, hot dogs, and we've done loads more in the recent weeks on hot schools and hospitals. Loads on health, maternal health.
Experts are warning about.
Lots on hay fever, lots on different kinds of health impacts and the way that heat affects health. Loads of things on how the NHS copes and different kinds of public services. We've also done a load of stuff in Wales, which I'll talk about a little bit, which it really gets to the heart of a lot of of the sort of thing we do. So that the way that communities are experiencing different kinds of impacts. A lot of the football clubs we've spoken to, a lot of the rugby clubs, grassroots level football clubs, rugby clubs across Wales are dealing with extreme weather of different kinds, including waterlogged pitches and flooding. But they're also dealing with really, really high energy costs, which are causing them to have to put showers on timers, not be able to keep the lights on, and risks closing the really important community spaces that are multi-generational, are protective against loneliness, against like not having community shared spaces where people do all sorts of things in a rugby club. It's where people have funerals, it's where people go and celebrate, it's where they mourn, it's where the local food bank is, it's where the local yoga class is, it's where the local parent group is. So these spaces are important in lots of ways, and it's a really useful way to think about how we do adaptation and mitigation to help protect community spaces like rugby clubs, and we've done a whole podcast on that. We've also got a library of like longer form stories about all the different kinds of impacts people are facing. So you've got fishers, farmers, footballers, GPs, midwives, pub landlords. So that's a really important part of like telling people stories about how it's happening to them at the moment. And in broad terms for us, that means that we are disrupting even in right-leaning papers, sort of you get your anti-green voices, but then you get our coverage of the sort of relatable climate impacts, which is really important for our audience because too often the things coming out of big climate brands just don't feel like they are for a lot of people. And we need lots of different kinds of communication, but we also need to make sure that people don't feel completely left out of that conversation. So we sort of try and sit between the sort of very extreme, how the media portray a very extreme skeptic or zealot, and we're trying to sit in the middle. I mean, it's not a true thing, but the extreme ends, but we try and sit in the middle of those things. So I'm just going to stop sharing to if I can. Has it worked? Yes, it has. To just carry on talking about how the adaptation part is really important for the sorts of audiences we talk to. So extreme weather is it can be, and we have seen it be a really political thing in lots of different places, including in Valencia with flooding, for example. And not tackling extreme weather is now a really, really huge and big issue. As the CCC report has been outlined, said, this is no longer something that is just coming down the road. We need to sort it out. We've just seen that in the heat waves. We've seen multiple day upon day of record-breaking temperatures. We've got public services who are having to close. Operations in the NHS are cancelled or can be cancelled at 26 degrees. We've got kids throwing up in classrooms and teachers not being able to work because they are unable to themselves because they're ill. So we've got a sort of disruption of all kinds of different parts of the country. Trains are another example. And so we need to not only think about how we stop those impacts getting worse through mitigation, we also need to think about how we are protecting people in the here and now, because people in the here and now are being impacted by climate change and are just as important as people in the future being impacted by climate change. And as B and Chris both talked about, the public are in a very, very sort of pragmatic place about this. Very few people, only 5% of people, would choose adaptation alone. And like most people want both, because most people think about the now and the future, and they don't want to trade that off. They want to trade off the people they love now and their safety with the people they love and their safety in the future. So they want both, and they're quite practical about that. And as we said, over 80% of people think we're not prepared, but 59% of people think we can be. So people are also in quite a positive space about this. And the thing that I think we need to think about is not just sort of like people's private spaces, like their homes, which are really important, but where people spend time, where people, what they want to do, what they love doing with the people that they love. And we need to make sure that we're talking about the protection of that and community spaces and people in those communities. And so me and Sam Alvis at IPPR wrote a paper on the progressive case for dealing with extreme weather. And I won't go into all of it. Obviously, don't have time. But basically, it is an argument that if we do not get on the front foot on adaptation, not only are we leaving people to sort of fend for themselves in impacts terms, which is basically some of what we're seeing at the moment, people building their own flood defences, people buying their own aircon for schools, we are allowing a sort of space politically to open up that sort of distracts from the things that we need to do. And it's not an either or, as I've said, like that is not where the public are at. People care about the now and the future. And we don't want to see an increase on the strain of the infrastructure, because that feeling that people have, that fatalism that people have that the UK is not working, that Britain is broken, gets worse through impacts as well as other things. And the investment in dealing with that is as important as the investment in other things to stop people feeling that way. In the NHS in general, it's important that is considered as part of the risk around that. And Jill Rutter actually wrote a piece in the FT today about this very thing. Jill Rutter from the Institute for Government, talking about the CCC report and saying that what the government has been doing and planning up to now clearly hasn't been working. It's time for a change. It's time for government to basically face up to the level of climate risk we're facing and the amount of climate risk individually people are sort of having to deal with. What she also said was that, and I'm directly quoting her here, nothing at the moment suggests that Andy Burnham is any more interested than Keir Starmer in this, and that there is no indication that he will appoint a big hitter to DEFRA, who hold all of the adaptation stuff. So it might be as low a priority for him as it has been for the other 7 prime ministers since the Climate Change Act in 2008. So this is important politically. Like, it is not something that is up it's not up the agenda politically, but it is going to hit people, and the political jeopardy that will come with that for individual politicians of a national, regional, and local level will be big. And the rugby club example is what I will end it on, because I think that is important, because I think people need to know that we, as climate advocates, care about the things that they care about, but also that government is willing to protect their communities, but also, their homes, the things they love, the things that they go and spend their time doing. And that is like such an important part of the emotional narrative around this. This is not about money for people, it's about protecting the space and the homes that they love. And I think politics has yet to catch up with that. And part of what Round Our Way does is to try and fill the gap between where the public are, which is broadly in pretty practical place, and where politicians think the public are, which is not the same. So we've got to tell these stories that illustrate that it's powerful, that bring the voices of the people being impacted directly into the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I thought that was a really nice way to end it. I think we've heard today from the three organisations represented in Climate Outreach's research. We've heard from Bea on the Citizens panel as well, and we've heard from Sophie at Round Our Way, and all of these organisations really trying to build this evidence base to government, both through kind of data and insights, but also the amazing stories that you've platformed, Sophie, and we can continue to build that evidence base and show the government that this is something that needs to be taken seriously, and that this will really have political jeopardy if they don't tackle this, as well as kind of obviously huge impacts on people's day-to-day lives. I'm going to sort of answer some, pose some of the questions now to some of our panelists. Had a huge amount of questions, so apologies that we won't get around to all of these. We did have a few couple of questions coming in about the extent of climate denialism in the UK population, and whether the segmentation and the kind of audience insights that we all have presented today are actually, is there still a sort of portion of the population that is really actually climate skeptic and denialist and doesn't want to see any action at all? And yeah, is there much evidence of that in the population, and should we be working to reach those audiences who maybe are not sold on this agenda at all? So I don't know, Chris, maybe firstly, do you have any thoughts on that from kind of the segmentation, I mean, and the data analysis that we've done?
Yeah, definitely. So the segmentation is based on lots of people and people's values, not necessarily specifically climate. So there isn't a group which we would like be named, or more in common would name like a climate denial group. We know that across all of the groups, the majority of people in all of the groups, though it's much higher for some, are believe in climate change and think it's important and action needs to be taken. So across all the groups, there is that commonality across it. We do know that the sort of 75%, there's different numbers. Somebody put 85% in the chat. 75% from our data that people are really concerned about climate, but we also know that people think that others are not. So people will estimate, but when you ask them, do you think other people think that concerned about climate, they tend to underestimate that and say that it's actually a minority viewpoint. So we need to make sure that as communicators, we continue to keep pushing that caring about climate is not a minority viewpoint. It's something that everybody, the vast majority of people are concerned about. The other thing about like who are the deep climate deniers. So when we asked the question, how concerned are you about climate? When people responded to that in our survey last year, we took away the top group of people who were like super concerned, and everybody else, we asked them the question, why are you not more concerned about climate? And gave them a bunch of options, including some and other that they could fill in their own. Now, people who said, I don't believe climate exists was really small. So it was overall, it's less than 3% of the climate change exists, does not exist, is less than 3% of the population are like hardcore deniers, it's not happening. There was a sizable proportion, maybe 2 or 3 times that, who said that they weren't more worried because they thought it'd been a bit exaggerated. So that could be someone who's quite concerned, but they're not very concerned because they think it's been exaggerated a little too much. So that's a work on being able to share these stories about impact, I guess. But the other thing is, like, a lot of people say they're not more concerned because they actively try not to think about bad things in their lives, or they've got bigger things that they say to worry about. So they answer the question, I'm not as concerned about climate change, because they feel they've got bigger fish to fry. And that's really important, because they do care about climate, they are concerned about it, but they've also got really other important things going on in their lives. And that's about linking the actions that we can take for climate to make people's lives better. And also as communicators to have that empathy that what we're talking about might not be the first thing that's the most important in somebody's lives, and not saying, no, you shouldn't be bothered about the things in your life, you should be bothered about this thing. It's about really communicating how the things that we all care about together are mutual and shared across so many different groups.
Thanks very much, Chris. I don't know, Sophie or Bea, if you wanted to come in on that point around climate denialism, but no worries if not, because we've got quite a few other questions. There was a question, and I think maybe this is more the Bea, but I'd be interested in the other panelists as well, around the severity of our rising temperatures, basically. And we've obviously got the projections potentially of 2 degrees warming by, I think, the end of the century, but then also 4 degrees after that. And kind of the communications approach we need to take there, like, is enough being done to communicate the severity of that impact, or even is that helpful? Do we risk sort of scaremongering people and kind of risk putting people off and kind of talking about this as though it's too difficult and it's too out of reach for us to do this? And I think it sort of also links to a question around, we've had obviously discussion around the impacts of our warming planet and our warming communities, and Sophie, you touched on a lot of those, but one person was asking around, are we doing enough to kind of highlight the stories and the examples of adaptation happening well, and actually the solutions and some of the tactics that are being and the policies that are being implemented to help people adapt. So I just wondered if anyone has any thoughts on either of those questions about kind of communicating the severity of our rising temperatures, and if we're doing that effectively, and then also that the communication of the positive ways that we can adapt as well.
I can do the severity one if you want.
Go ahead.
So, and I guess on linking to solutions, we work with others who do that. So Local Storytelling Exchange are a great example of people who communicate very well across different kinds of media and different kinds of outputs on solutions and people doing great things in their communities. We do the weather stuff. So I always joke with them that I'm the doom and they're the hope. But like, especially for our audience, like just raising the salience of like, this is happening here and now in places like you live. It's not happening in a far away place or further into the future. It's already happening. And it's, it's a fine balance to make sure that you're not needlessly scaring people. But over the last 3 heat waves, for example, we've done lots of different kinds of media. We've worked with lots of different organizations to get different kinds of voices into the media. So your scientists and your academics, but also your day-to-day experts like your doctors and your teachers, as well as people who've been impacted, just to show the kinds of things that will happen. And like, the first question I was asked on LBC is 35 degrees. That's not too warm, is it, really? Like France and Spain will be laughing at us. And it's like, well, I can put that into context for you, which is at 26 degrees in an operating theatre in the NHS, they can cancel a whole surgical list. The CCC had a great stat in their report, which is there's a 10% attainment difference on passing exams between 32 degrees and 22 degrees. And it's obviously partly about the kinds of buildings we have and how well we can adapt to it. But this is, the humidity as well. It is very severe, and we are trying to do that in lots of different ways. We do it from a what do people care about? How can we link it to climate change way? Other people do it in different ways, and we need to do that. We work with weather presenters a lot, for example, which are trusted messengers who a lot of people listen to, and we'll be able to explain the science in like an accessible way. So I think there is a lot being done on that. I think there are barriers to getting it to another level, which is sometimes it's political, but sometimes it's also just like media and just like doing more briefings with media just to get people in that space, because you'll see, for example, loads of flooding coverage, but then will be like hardly any link to climate. ECIU have just done an analysis of the recent heat waves and how often climate change and the link to climate change was made in the coverage, and it is better on broadcast, but it's still not 100%.
Yeah, and I think that links to their ECIU have done some interesting research where linking showing that actually even coverage of net zero now, headlines referring to net zero, doesn't even talk about climate change within the body of the text. So it kind of links that disconnect between the kind of the terminology there as well. B, did you want to come in on the kind of your graph, I suppose, especially, and the kind of severity of the projections, and are we communicating that effectively, or how should we communicate that really?
I think it's such a good question. And, as ever, it depends a lot on the audience. So our primary audience is government, which means often we go a bit more techie, a bit more graph heavy, and slightly harder hitting on the impacts, because ultimately we're trying to spur policy action. But I fully take the point. I think it was raised in a few Q&A actually, that, if you're trying to communicate with your granny, or for example in the citizens panel, it is not really that helpful to show a graph like that, and you want to be very mindful of the impact and what's within people's control. So for the citizens panel, we had to think quite carefully about this, partly because of the ethical implications of bringing up to speed members of the public about what could be coming, and potentially leaving them feeling much more concerned than they were at the start of the process. So I don't claim to be the expert on this, but I guess some of the things we tried to focus on were making the impacts really tangible and kind of, spelling out examples of how local areas might be affected, and then also really focusing on the solution. So the reason that we need to highlight this risk, right, is to spur action. So making clear what individuals can do, as well as making clear what's really within the scope for government to do, to give that sense, that genuine sense of what can actually be done. Like all the actions that we've sort of set out that need to happen they're not novel, they're not really technologically complex, they're all doable. They just require like investment and commitment from government and others. So really making that clear, I think, can help, but it's not an easy one.
No, thank you, Lee. So thanks everyone so much. There's still lots of questions coming in, and I'm just going to take a few more. There was a question around there's a couple of linked questions really about the sort of public attitudes on the different types of climate impacts. And obviously, Sophie, you've spotlighted your work on particularly on kind of heat waves as well, but also flooding. And I guess Chris as well, is there much kind of insights that we've done, or I don't know, of the citizens panel as well about is there sort of a hierarchy here? Like, do the public see flooding as a top priority, or heat waves, or drought, or is that kind of not really separated out and people kind of generally want to see action across the board? Or do you think there's certain things that are hitting communities more immediately and that the government kind of will be listening to a bit more?
So from the national survey point of view and from the focus groups we've done, it's very much thinking about local impacts and what people see there. So, for example, when we ask about that question that I mentioned about what are the climate impacts that you're most concerned about a quarter of everybody in GB says that they are concerned about flooding. About a quarter say they're concerned about heat waves. But if you just look at Greater London, for example, the heat waves one goes right up, and that's because of the effect of higher temperatures in urban areas. And so, from a communication point of view, if you know the audience that you're speaking to, especially if it's in a specific place or location, thinking about what are those impacts that are most affecting that local area or most going to affect that local area, what people have experiences of. That's the kind of leading thing that you can focus on. If you don't have that, because a lot of people want to do this kind of communication before an incident or before something has happened, it's about thinking about other people's stories from places that are kind of similar. So where you can see another village or another urban area or another set of people who hold similar values to you, who are experiencing something in a slightly and maybe in a different location, and trying to make that link and make people say, oh, okay, so these folk are like me, their situation is like me as well. I want to be able to make that simple connection when we're doing the communication about taking action. I don't know if Bea wants to come in.
Yeah, I think that. Oh, sorry. Did you want to go, Sophia?
Sorry, you go and then I'll go.
Just briefly, so I can only speak in detail to the citizens panel, which is obviously a small group of people. But in that discussion, it was striking that the particular emphasis was on flooding and transport. And I think Chris is right to point to local area and local impacts. I think more people in that group were familiar with the impacts of flooding. There was a bit less of a sense that people had already been impacted by overheating. So I think it's a really good point to sort of focus in on people's lived experience and what will feel more real to them, and if not, to bring in stories. So we kind of tried to bring in videos of people who've been affected by other hazards to try and make it more real for people, because it can be really hard to imagine, right, how bad overheating is until you're in it, for example. So
yeah, and I just add that what Chris describes is what Round Our Way does. So we work with people in local areas on the things that have impacted them, and the way that we do the stories, as you could probably see from the very whistle-stop tour that we've done, is we're not climate first. So how is climate change impacting you? You might not even realize that has been happening. So like to cost or the size of your chocolate bar or your favorite meal, or we did loads of stuff on Easter lamb with ECIU over Easter. But I think it is quite psychological, but also probably built in us for good reason. People can't remember being hot once they stop being hot. So actually there are some interesting things about how you communicate around heat and the opportunity you get to communicate in the heat compared to when it's past, which is slightly different for other impacts like wildfires, droughts and flooding, because you can see the impacts continue. There is quite a lot of polling that shows impacts raise salience in the moment, but they only lead to people's increased support for climate change action if that link is made, because otherwise, I mean, often you'll see it a lot on like the videos we do on social media, that you do get quite a lot of climate denial on there, which I don't think means that it's going up. I think it just means the algorithm is serving that. But like, say we've got loads of stuff on a flood that's flash flooding, a lot of people will respond and talk about drains. Wildfires, a lot of people will respond and talk about ignition. Now, in both cases, climate change is still important, because it doesn't matter how a fire was ignited. It matters how long it lasts and how hard it is to put out, which is obviously worse in the summer. So there are lots of nuances to this, but I think the most important thing, as both B and Chris said, is the relatability of it and making sure people can see themselves in it. Because I think too often we reach for graphs and technicalities, and even the word net zero, to be honest, and actually that isn't the language that people would use. And it's part of the reason, in my view, that politics is sort of not seeing it, because they're like, well, they're not using that word, they're not using the word climate. A lot of people won't, and that's fine. It's about what they're worried about and how they express that, as well as their own experience of that impact. It might be that their kids' football has been cancelled 3 weeks in a row, or it might be that their house was flooded. There's lots of different kinds of ways that impacts happen to people and communities.
And we're nearly at time, but you sort of made me think there, Sophie, if there's any final words for any of the panelists on. Somebody asked a question about how do we get people talking about adaptation in a casual office environment, and it just made me think, do you have any final closing words, I guess, B or Chris, from your sort of insights on how best do we just strike up these conversations, whether that be with our neighbour in the office or in everyday? We sort of answered this, and Sophie's given it some really good insight there, but I just wondered, any final thoughts from our other two panelists on how we start these conversations?
I think it's talking about your own experiences. It's talking about how you feel and things that have impacted you. And as Sophie was saying, you don't have to leave with climate. You just talk about what's happening around you and those impacts, and not just the negative things. It's too hot, or I can't get the products that I want to buy, the foods I want to buy now. It's also about the actions that you see happening, and isn't that great?
I totally agree. I think as part of our advice, we commissioned a report to look at the role of local authorities in delivery of adaptation. And what was really striking is just how key local action, whether it's local government or communities or individuals, is on building resilience and adapting. So I think linking it to local actions, and if people are looking for something to do, thinking around how they can engage with local government to encourage them to take action is like a positive way to channel that interest and energy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. And just before we close as well, there was a question about the visualization of this as well, and how do we get our media and our journalism to be more responsible in the images that they're using. And I just wanted to put a nod to Climate Visuals, which is a climate outreach project, and we can send around the link to that after. And there's a huge range of photography and imagery on that climate visuals library that you can use, and it really provides a guide for journalists and for the media as well, and for people in the public communicating about responsible imagery. And we've all seen so many images of people sunning themselves and people on beaches, which is great, and some people do enjoy this hot weather, but really that library, that climate visuals library, exists to provide
Can I just add to
well.
that,
Yes,
because I sort of mentioned it, obviously we don't get to choose what images are used on the work we do, but that is something we speak to journalists about quite a lot, and it is one of our aims, is to move the sort of narrative from barbecues on the beach to, this is dangerous, this is really, really bad, and for people, for older people, like babies, vulnerable people, pregnant people. And I think I do think over this heat wave we've seen a little bit more of that change. I really think the schools closing stuff has cut through a little bit, and I do think that sort of trying to find ways on that political jeopardy are really important. And I also think you've got to balance that with acknowledging that people are being impacted now, but also acknowledging that we don't always want to be the doom mongers, right? So it's okay, as you say, to go and enjoy the heat safely, but also in the balance have that this will affect some people in some places in ways that we need to deal with, because we need to keep everyone safe.
Absolutely. And the QR code is on the screen there to find out more from Climate Outreach's research. And it just remains me to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you to our fantastic panelists, Chris, B and Sophie. And the webinar has been recorded, and we will share the recording and the slides to participants afterwards. Thank you very much, everybody.